Welcome to Health Assist. Today we will continue to learn about the physiology of skin. So let's start now. Let's start the physiology of skin. This is the second video on physiology of skin, and the first video you can watch by seeing previous video. The link is mentioned in the description box. Here you can see layers of epidermis. In the top there is orange color layer. In this pic you can see this orange color layer is the stratum corneum, and below stratum corneum there is green color layer, it is stratum lucidum, and below lucidum there is another layer. In this pic it is purple color, it is called as stratum granulosum, and below granulosum there is another layer called as stratum spinosum, and below stratum spinosum there is the deepest and innermost layer of the epidermis called as stratum basale, also called as stratum germinativum. So by these 5 layers the epidermis is formed. The first and the outermost layer, that is stratum corneum, is already explained in previous video, you can watch. Now let's start with stratum lucidum. This layer is superficial to the stratum granulosum, or you can say the stratum lucidum is present just below the stratum corneum. It is a pale, wavy looking layer. It is formed by many layers of flattened and closely packed cells whose outlines have become quite indistinct and nuclei have disappeared. So the cells does not have a nucleus, or the nucleus of the cell disappeared in the cells of stratum lucidum and also in the cells of stratum corneum. Now this layer appears at the innermost portion of the stratum corneum as a thin, homogeneous and slightly eosinophilic area, which is seen best where the horny layer is thickest, such as on palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. It means where the outer layer, that is stratum corneum, is thickest, at that places the stratum lucidum can be seen. Now stratum granulosum. Above the stratum spinosum is the granular layer known as stratum granulosum, or you can say stratum granulosum. It is present in between the stratum lucidum and stratum spinosum. It is composed of flat fusiform cells which are 1 to 3 layers thick, and these cells contain irregular granules of keratohyalin and lysosomal enzymes and cysteine rich proteins. It means these cells contain some granules, and these granules have the keratohyalin, lysosomal enzymes and proteins, and these keratohyalin granules bind to the keratin filaments, that is tonofilaments, to form large electron dense masses within the cytoplasm that give this layer its granular appearance. And the lamellar granules, that is keratinosomes, are found just above the stratum spinosum and near the granular cell layers. These keratinosomes are also known as Odland bodies, which take part in barrier function of the epidermal permeability. And the granular contents of the Odland bodies are discharged into the intercellular space below the conified cell layer, and form an effective waterproof barrier. It means oddland bodies form an effective waterproof barrier. Now, stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum is superficial to the stratum germinativum, or you can say the stratum spinosum is present in between the stratum granulosum and stratum germinativum. This is the fourth layer of the epidermis, stratum spinosum. It was first seen with low magnification and described in the 1600th century by Marcello Malpighi, an Italian anatomist of the 17th century, so also called as stratum Malpighi. While according to current nomenclature, stratum Malpighi includes both the stratum spinosum and stratum germinativum. Here you can see the pig. The topmost layer is the stratum corneum, and you can see in the stratum corneum the dead cells filled with keratin, or the dead cells desquamated. And below the stratum corneum you can see stratum lucidum, and below this stratum granulosum, the cells with granules, and then stratum spinosum, and last one stratum basale. Stratum basale also called as stratum germinativum. And the stratum spinosum is composed of several layers of polyhedral cells connected to each other by interconnected bridges. A high concentration of desmosomes and keratin filaments give the cells a characteristic spiny appearance. Hence, this layer known as stratum spinosum. It is also called as prickle cell layer. And the stratum spinosum is also known as squamous cell layer. And the cells of this layer are polygonal in shape and gradually flatten as they approach the surface, as they approach the outside towards the stratum corneum. The cells of this layer becomes gradually flattened. A daughter cell from the stratum germinativum moves upwards through this layer as an individual, not as a part of unit. It means the cells of the stratum germinativum moves upwards towards the outside, towards the stratum corneum. It means that the stratum spinosum must break and reform the remarkably complex desmosomes numerous times. Hence, a tumor or squamous cell carcinoma with metastatic potential, more common in immunosuppressed renal transplant patients, which is derived from these cells. Now, stratum germinativum. This is the deepest portion of the epidermis and the last layer of epidermis. It is composed of columnar cells placed perpendicular to the surface of the skin. It is also known as basal cell layer. So, stratum germinativum, also called as basal cell layer, and the whole of the epidermis germinates from this layer, so known as stratum germinativum. In this diagram, you can see the dead cells flaking off at the skin surface at the top, and then a stratum corneum, and a stratum lucidum is a very thin layer below the stratum corneum, and then stratum granulosum, few layers of the granular cells, and below granulosum there is stratum spinosum, and at the lowest part that that is stratum basale or stratum germinativum, and below this layer the dermis started. And any trauma above the level of this stratum means above the stratum germinativum, if any trauma occur or any injury if develop over the above this stratum heals without scarring, but the trauma to this stratum would result in scarring. This layer is composed of two distinct cells, that is the keratinocytes and melanocytes. The keratinocytes are capable of actively producing several cytokines. Cytokines, it is a kind of regulatory proteins that are involved in the inflammatory conditions. And basal cell carcinoma is most common in human cancers, and this carcinoma is derived from the basal cells, means from this layer, and grows as dark staining nodules infiltrating the dermis. The melanocytes appear as clear cell with a small dark staining nucleus and a clear cytoplasm. They are wedged, means the melanocytes scattered between keratinocytes in a ratio of approximately 1:10. Each new keratinocyte takes about 28 days to ascend through the epidermis and stratum corneum and de-squamate at the skin surface. This process greatly accelerated in some inflammatory skin disorders. It means first you should know all the layers of the epidermis germinates from this layer, from stratum germinativum, and the cells which is keratinocyte takes about 28 days to ascend to reach towards the outside, towards the stratum corneum, and when the cells keratinocytes reach up to stratum corneum, and then it de-squamate off or it is shaded. So it is the usual or normal process, but this process may be accelerated or increased in some inflammatory disorder. Thanks for watching. To know more detail, just waiting to our upcoming videos on Health Assist, and don't forget to subscribe this channel.